Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. I have my Oxford World Classics edition right here. The translation for this book was done by the Mods. So I know this is a highly regarded translation. So I'm not really going to review the book per se. I'm just going to talk about the book and just talk about what I thought of it, and I know this is a really popular book on YouTube, and it remains a book that people go back to and read. Maybe it's a little notorious for its length. This is about 1,300 plus pages, this edition, but I think to anyone who wants to read it, it's a very accessible book in some ways. It's not necessarily like modernist literature or postmodernist literature that can be very experimental with language and narrative and things like this. Whereas this book is very much a straight narrative. It's really the English translation, it's really straightforward language. Tolstoy, a good stylist and everything, but he isn't necessarily trying to do all sorts of tricks with language or things like that. It's a pretty straightforward book. It's pretty easy to follow if you go along with the story. I should say though, this was my first time reading it, and I've taken different attempts to read it before, and I think before I just would get diverted or just kind of put it away. Impatience can set in, but this time I was really determined to finish it. I should say though that there were some, and I think everyone probably has this experience reading this book where there's some parts you pay more attention to. There's other parts of it where you kind of go a little bit faster through and don't maybe give it the full attention. But hey, we're the reader, and it's the reader's prerogative of how you want to take on the novel. It's not as if everyone who reads this has to go write a a long thesis or dissertation on it. It's a book meant to be enjoyed and pondered upon and things like that. So wow, where to begin though? The novel. So first of all, the setting. It is set in Russia, mainly alternating between Moscow and St. Petersburg. It's during the Napoleonic Wars of the early 19th century. So a good part of the first portion of the book is set in 1805 and culminates with the Battle of Austerlitz, which was a famous defeat for the Russians and the alliance that was fighting Napoleon. And then we get some montage stuff in between. The bulk of the book takes place in 1812 during the French invasion of Russia and the ensuing campaigns that took place and the effect it had on the characters and just on Russia in general as as a society and as a country. So really the book is set specifically in this Napoleonic era. It follows three main characters. There's Natasha, who we first meet when she's a teenager, and she's comes from a prominent family in Russia, and I guess like the English, she's sort of a debutante when the book begins. She's a very precocious daughter, and we kind of mature with Natasha as the story moves on. We have Prince Andre, who is a another member, I guess the scion of another prominent family in Russia, and he is the character who kind of has everything. Like he has wealth, he has a beautiful wife, he has all sorts of prestige, he's well educated. He's had a very privileged life, and yet Andre is a bit unhappy and ends up joining the Russian army as an officer and taking part in these campaigns. And then The third main character is Pierre, who we meet as he is sort of a student who has just finished his studies at the start of the book, and he is kind of a pseudo intellectual, has aspirations to be an intellectual, and he's very caught up with what's happening in Russia and what Napoleon means, what it means for Europe and everything. But he's also a character who is throughout the book kind of trying to find searching for his identity and is trying to make sense of what it all means. Pierre is also a deeply flawed character. He's kind of lazy. He seems to be a much better talker sometimes than putting his ideas about life into practice. But we follow Pierre through his various endeavors in the book, and something happens early in the novel to Pierre, and he is the illegitimate son of a Russian nobleman, and eventually, but he does end up inheriting a fortune of the father through some various machinations. So Pierre kind of has also a fortune put upon him as well, and that's a big part of his character. So those are the three principal characters, and of course there are many, many characters we meet in the book as well. We meet soldiers, officers. We meet Russian society, and the book itself, War and Peace, is the title, where the sections of the book alternate between the military side of it, the campaigns and the war and all that, and then back to Moscow or St. Petersburg and all of the social intrigue and social change happening in Russia during this time. And clearly Tolstoy himself was a part of the privileged class in Russia, so he knew that world very well. And so we spend a lot of time at balls and dinner parties and weddings and things like that too. So that's of the book kind of alternates between that structure quite a bit. I guess they could sort of converge a little bit when the war actually comes into Russia and affects the characters who are at the home front. And I should mention as well that real historical people also appear in the book. Napoleon himself is a character who appears throughout, and the Russian military commanders and the Russian Tsar Alexander, who was the young Tsar of Russia at the time, is also a character in the book. And like I said, I've read a little bit of historical fiction, so I'm fairly familiar with that approach of putting real characters, fictional characters, in with historical characters, and that had been done before Tolstoy, of course. But this is a novel that maybe was a crucial book as far as historical fiction goes, and the idea, one of the big ideas in the book is Russia, like the nation state of Russia. What were the forces at play in making the nation what it was, and I'll get more into that later. And you also have this kind of sub well parallel theme in the book of history itself. Tolstoy fancied himself kind of a historian, and there's historical essays in this book as well. In fact, the book ends with a very famous historical essay where Tolstoy attempts to explain what the book was all about and his theory of the forces of history. And this is very 19th century, like taking inspiration from people like Hegel, and like what are the forces at play that lead a nation down its path, like what is like the will of a nation. And I think the book is making connections to what shapes us as individuals, like all the influences at play with us that shape us as a person and shape our worldviews, and why we do what we do. Sometimes it can be hard to explain our own actions or hard to explain the actions of others, but as time passes, we get perspectives on the forces at play that shape people and individuals, and you can Tolstoy kind of takes that a few levels higher of looking at what makes a nation, what leads any society to where it arrives at. So it's very theoretical and kind of interesting, a bit dry at times. Some might find that aspect of the book to be kind of dry, but nevertheless, it's there and something that historians have taken seriously. There's a famous book by the historian Isaiah Berlin, which I have the book, but I've not read it. But maybe I'll review it at some point. But he does a kind of a deep analysis of Tolstoy's theory of history too. And there's a lot of military stuff in the book. Like the book kind of veers between melodrama, a lot of dramatic stuff happening with courtships and romances and um, people trying to, you know, make their way in society. So there's that aspect, but you also have like the war side of it, where you have a lot of Tolstoy writing about military strategy and specific battles. Like there's a set piece of the Battle of Austerlitz and also the Battle of Borodino, which was one of the important battles in that French invasion of Russia. And Tolstoy tries to put the reader inside these battles, and a lot of writing about why battles go a certain way. And Tolstoy is criticizing historians a lot who kind of come to specific conclusions sometimes about why wars and battles go a certain way, like your prototypical armchair people. And of course, they exist all over the place today if you follow military and politics, who kind of make their armchair analysis and make their declarations about battles and wars and generals and all this type of thing. So some readers might not find that interesting. If you are someone like a military history person, you might find some of that of value to you as well. So it is interesting, but it's an interesting mix of the melodrama of people, the character dramas, but also the more analytical side of the book as well. Um, but yeah, and I think, and Tolstoy is sort of saying that it's the forces in like a massive battle are so complicated, and it's extremely difficult to come to any firm conclusions about why things happen the way they do, because there's just so many complex forces at play. So it's interesting stuff, but that's a big part of what the book is. So as far as what I thought of the book, I there were parts of it I really enjoyed. There were parts of it, of course, I found dull. The pace was agonizingly slow at times, but you also get some moments of insight and things like that with the characters. I didn't really like the characters all that much in the book. I think it was hard for me to find a character to latch on to. Like, I did not hate the characters. It was not like I couldn't stand them. I just was more indifferent to the characters in the book, would be a more of a more accurate way of saying it. One other thing I was thinking as well as I was reading the book, and I'm sure I'm not the first person to say this, is that the focus on the most privileged people in Russia at the time, like a lot of me is thinking about, well, what's happening in the streets, or, what's this like for, the workers and the laborers and things like that. And we do get those characters throughout, and Tolstoy incorporates a little of that into the book, but it is so hyper focused on the aristocracies and the privileged classes, and that's interesting. Like, I mean, it is interesting to learn about all of these hierarchies and intrigues and all that, but you do feel like you're getting sometimes a not the full picture of what was happening at the time. And I'm sure Tolstoy was aware of this, but that was just one thing. It's not even really a criticism, really, and I don't want to criticize a book for what it's not because that's a little unfair. But that was just one thing that I was thinking as I was reading it, and so I did find this. I found the first half of the book a bit more engaging for some reason. I found the second half, especially the last third, fourth, to be really, I mean, it really slows down and it does test your patience a little bit as we get into, as Tolstoy is explaining what's happening during the French invasion and why things are happening the way they are and all the drama happening within all this. Like it's there is something that feels a bit repetitive at times in the book. And you know, part this is probably, and I don't necessarily would argue this, like someone said, well, the book should have really been edited down, a lot to maybe tighten up the narrative a little bit, just so it would work. Now, I've read the other big Tolstoy novel, Anna Karenina, which is not quite, but about half the length of War and Peace. And I think Anna Karenina was a much more effective novel in terms of the characters are more sharply drawn a bit in that, and there was, I think, it didn't have all the baggage of, of dealing with all of these, you know, complex historical issues that occupied Tolstoy with War and Peace. So, yeah, that was one thing I was thinking, where it is a chore to get through some of these things, but it is 19th century literature, which tended to be a lot more had to be more descriptive, more detailed. Part of me thinks Tolstoy would have liked cinema. I think he did kind of have a cinematic way of approaching things, where trying to capture just the tapestry of people and individuals. I think cinema might have been something that Tolstoy may have, if he lived long enough. I think he was still alive when cinema was in its early phase, but it would have been interesting if it would have been curious to think what Tolstoy would have thought of cinema. So yeah, and there's a thought I have in it, and as I was reading it too, I was kind of comparing it to Ulysses, James Joyce, which is a book that I enjoy a lot more than this, just because I think Joyce, but sets the book in one uneventful day in history in Dublin, but it is a very Ulysses is very much a book of the people, where Joyce is putting us on the streets of Dublin, and we're interacting with all sorts of people and things like that. So there is, and yet there are those, of course, many layers and levels to Ulysses as well. But ultimately, Ulysses is about the experience of everybody, living out their lives, and it's, I guess I'm more biased for the 20th century. I like modernism more, and postmodernism, and I like to read the 19th century literature, but I do find kind of that straight narrative approach you get with the 19th century descriptive approach. Sometimes I just prefer more modern literature in that regard. But anyway, I'm glad I read War and Peace. I know there's been many film adaptations of War and Peace, and I did start watching the recent one that was done for Amazon Prime. It was made in 2016, and I watched the first episode, which I thought was pretty good. And maybe I'll come back and talk about the miniseries, but I do think this book is conducive to adaptations because there's so much story, there's so much material to draw upon in this book that you could kind of bend it into an interesting screenplay for a movie, for a film, and really streamline it. That was the sense I got from the first episode of this miniseries, which is really fast paced, and it's really kind of streamlining the narrative a lot. And yet, I think since, and also staying, you know, very loyal to the book as well. So like I said, maybe I'll come back and talk about the adaptation. So anyway, just some thoughts about War and Peace. Like I said, I know this was not like a deep read of annotations and taking extensive notes and, you know, reading about Russian society and getting into the nonfiction side of it and reading about the Napoleonic Wars. And so you could really build a whole library around War and Peace and to get closer to the book. And that's cool when I think you can do a lot of outside reading and research that makes the book better and more accessible to you. So, like I said, I'm glad I read it. It's I did not. I, of course, I have some criticisms of it, but nevertheless, it's an important book, and probably will always be thinking about it for some time, and always, you know, comparing it to other books that I read, but also seeing its influence as well. Reading historical fiction that came after War and Peace. So, anyway, thanks for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye.